Good morning, everybody. My name is Curtis Mitch, and I'm with the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. And welcome back to another one of our installments of our weekday reflections on the daily Mass readings. Today is Monday, September 28th already. And today I'd like to focus in particular on the first reading, which comes from a book, not of the New Testament, but of the Old Testament. It's from the book of Job, chapter 1, verses 6 through 22. Now, today's reading is a challenging one. It's the story of a man who is crushed under an avalanche of misfortune, all right? He experiences a traumatic degree of misery and grief in his life. And the surprising thing that we learn about this is that none of this is an accident. Okay? This is the result of an agreement, a wager, if you will, that was made in heaven between God and Satan. And God is the one who actually instigated, who set in motion this whole thing. And what we learn from today's reading is that the sufferings, the great traumatic sufferings experienced by the man Job, are in fact a test. They're a test of his faith. And it's an ordeal that is to be imposed upon Job. For what reason? Well, we're not told entirely, except that what we learn by the time we get to the end of the book is that this test was an ordeal to increase his virtues and thereby increase the blessings that God gives him. So I'd like to say just a few things about the book of Job in general, just to put this in context, and then we'll focus in on today's reading and try to get the lesson out of it that God has put into it for us and for our salvation. All right, so the first thing about the book of Job is that it's a very challenging book to read and very mysterious in a lot of ways. That shouldn't discourage you from reading it. You should read the book of Job and meditate upon it. The book itself is mainly a collection of poetry. Okay, the great bulk of the 42 chapters of the book of Job are poetry. Most of that appears in the form of a dialogue between Job and three of his friends who come to comfort him. Although they give him little comfort, they really offer him more criticism than anything else. But in addition to all of that poetry, we have the front end of the book and the back end of the book are capped with a prologue and an epilogue that are written in prose. And that's where today's reading comes from. It comes from the prologue, the very beginning, where we're setting the stage for what is about to happen throughout the next 42 chapters of this book. And the theme, and this is the thing that you really want to kind of latch onto, the theme of the book of Job is really about the question of suffering. The book of Job wrestles with the question of suffering. That is its focus, really from beginning to end. And Job's friends represent an old understanding of suffering, if you will. Okay, the idea that suffering is deserved is part of the old orthodoxy. If you go back deeper into the Old Testament, into the law of Moses, for example, it is very clear that when God wants to chastise his people because they have sinned, because they have defected from the covenant, because they have turned away from the way of righteousness which he sets out before them and asks them to walk, he imposes suffering. Suffering is a consequence of sin. But here's the thing. It's as the divine revelation over the centuries begins to unfold, as God begins to shed a little more light slowly and incrementally into the minds of his people, the book of Job is trying to introduce something new. It's trying to introduce the whole notion of undeserved suffering. All right, that's the conundrum in the book, is that Job he's not sinless, but he's not guilty of any sin that is equal to the magnitude of the suffering that is imposed upon him at the same time. His conscience is clear, and yet he is put through an ordeal that few human beings could barely be expected to survive. Okay? And so the whole notion of innocent suffering is something that Job's friends can't compute. It's not a part of their math so to speak. They don't view the world that way. In their world, there is no such thing as undeserved suffering or innocent suffering. All suffering must be the result of sin. So if Job is suffering, there must be unconfessed sin in his life. There must be some transgression that he is unwilling to bring forward and come clean on. That's their perspective. And yet Job is saying, no, I haven't done anything wrong. In fact, when the book introduces the man Job, which is a little bit before today's reading, it says there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright. He's one who feared God and one who turned away from evil. So Job is a saintly man. He is not some terrible sinner, and yet he is suffering terribly. And so how is that possible? That's where the book of Job is bringing us. It's trying to move the question of suffering into new territory. We know that some suffering in this world is deserved. God chastises us for our sins. He wants to correct our way and bring us back to the right way. Okay? That's part of some suffering is precisely that. It's God's corrective hand. Now, the book of Job is trying to break into this, break that old mold and kind of add something new to it. There is also something that we would call undeserved suffering. It's suffering that isn't the result of sin. It's suffering that can be imposed to expand your faith, to purify your faith, and to help you advance in virtue. Now, even this is just a step on the way, because in the book of Job, by the time you get to the end, you realize you still don't understand the full meaning of suffering. Okay, there's still a cloak. There's still an element of mystery to suffering at the end of the book of Job. All right, we have to wait until the New Testament, when Jesus Christ, who is the innocent one par excellence, it is not until then that we learn that suffering can actually be redemptive. Not only is innocent suffering possible, but that it has a saving value in the plan of God. That's not something we learn quite yet in the book of Job. It's another step on the way to the fullness of God's revelation in Jesus Christ in the New Testament. So that brings us to our first reading today. The book of Job, chapter 1, beginning in verse 6, running all the way to the verse 22. It says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God," who are the sons of God? Those are the angels. "There's a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them." Satan is actually a Hebrew word, in case you're not aware of that. Hasatan is the adversary. All right, it's a prosecutor in court. It's somebody who brings accusations and charges of wrongdoing against you. That's what the name Satan actually means. So Satan came also among them, and the Lord said to him, "Whence have you come?" And Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down upon it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil?" Now notice what God is doing here. What we're learning is that this ordeal of suffering that Job is about to suffer is something that God himself instigated. He initiates this. He's the one who makes his servant Job the target of all the misfortune that is about to come crashing down upon him. Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? You have put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side. You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only upon himself do not put forth your hand." So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. Now there was a day when the sons and daughters were eating and drinking in their eldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job, and he said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, there came another and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. The fire of God from heaven is a biblical way of referring to lightning, incidentally. Okay, and I alone, he says, have escaped to tell you. And while he, the second messenger, was still speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 companies and made a raid upon the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, a 4th messenger comes and says to Job, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. So Job has instantly lost almost everything that he has, except the shirt on his back and the wife at his side. All of his oxen, all of his donkeys, all of his sheep, all of his camels, and now even his 7 sons and his 3 daughters. Then Job arose, and he tore his robe, and he shaved his head, which is an act of mourning in the ancient world, and he fell upon the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. So what do we learn? We learn that Job's suffering is the result of a wager made in heaven, that Satan will administer this test to the man Job, but God is the one who is ultimately behind it. He's the one who allows it and sets the parameters, right? He sets limits to Satan. He says, you can touch all that he has, but you can't touch the man himself. Now, that will actually change as you keep reading on in Job 2, but that's where we're at in the story at this point. And at one level, the suffering that is imposed upon Job, the loss of all of his property, of all of his belongings, of all of his capital in the form of livestock, and then all of his family, all at once on the same day. What is this about? It is a test of his faithfulness. And at this early stage in the story, we see that Job is passing the test. He's doing quite well. In verse 22, in all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong, even though he just lost everything. But that's only at one level. I think there's a deeper level to the test of Job, and that's what appears in verses 9 through 11. It's not just a test of his faithfulness, although it certainly is that. At a deeper level, it's a test of his motive. Listen to what Satan says. I really think this is the key to today's reading. Listen to what Satan says in verses 9, 10, and 11. He says to the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? You have put a hedge around him and his house and all he has on every side. You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. All right? In other words, what is Satan saying? He's saying, well, of course Job serves you. Of course he's faithful, because you have made his life a bed of roses, right? You have blessed him abundantly. He has no needs, no wants, and no sufferings. Of course he serves you. But what if you take all that away? I bet he would turn around and curse you. I bet he would terminate his relationship with you if, in fact, we took away all the blessings that you have given, including the blessing of protection, this hedge that you have placed around him. So the test we're learning here is a test of the purity of Job's devotion. Does Job serve God just because of the blessings that God gives him? Or does he serve God because he is God? All right? It's the purity of his faith that is in question. Is serving God, and this is a question we can ask ourselves, do we serve God out of self-interest, or do we serve God because he is God? That's really the question. And Satan thinks that in the case of the man Job, that if you just take away the things that God has given, if you take away the easy life of plenty and prosperity that God has given to him, he will end up turning his back on God, all right? And he will go a different way. But in fact, is that what happens? It's not what happens, as we learn. But you could also say that this is a test of a lesson on detachment, all right? When we're serving God, do we attach ourselves to those gifts that he gives us, or are we more attached to the giver of those gifts? All right, that's also part of, what's baked into the pie here, all right? Is Job attached to these things, yes or no? And when we examine this, when Job looks at this situation, he examines his suffering. He looks at his suffering through the prism of death, doesn't he? Because when you go to the very end there at verse 21, what does Job say? All right, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. In other words, I didn't come into this world with anything, and as it happens, I won't be able to take anything out of it when I leave, okay? Your relationship with God, Job's relationship with God, my relationship with God, and your relationship with God is something that the only thing you can take with you out of this world is not the blessings that God has given you, at least not material blessings, temporal blessings, friends, family, and possessions of all sorts. These things you can't take with you. The only thing you take with you is your soul. And your soul is either attached to God himself, who is lasting and everlasting, or your soul is attached to the things of this passing world, the things that will be gone and turned to dust before we know it. All right? And so that's really a question for us. This is directly pertinent to our own Christian life. Why do we serve God? Do we serve God for selfish reasons? Or is our faith really attached to God and not just to his blessings? Do we realize and do we evaluate our lives and live our lives in light of our end? That's really the challenge, isn't it? Because naked you came from your mother's womb, but you will return again with nothing. You will leave the world with the same things you came into it with, and that doesn't even include clothes, does it? All right? So viewing life in view of our end, which is death, which is inevitable for all, helps us to put our life in perspective. And that's the perspective that I think Job gives us today. So be encouraged, brothers and sisters, to live like Job and to look at your situation like Job. You might be experiencing a time of prosperity, a time of material abundance. And that's wonderful, and you can acknowledge that as the blessing of God. Or you might be living in times of adversity and want. Things might be leaner this year than they were last year. Or in fact, you might be experiencing some pretty crushing misfortune in your own life. You might be experiencing some real sadness and real pain. And the challenge is to bless the name of the Lord regardless of the circumstances that you're in. All right? It's only important that you attach your soul to God, because that's the only thing that you can take with you out of this life is your relationship with God. So bless the name of the Lord. Attach yourself to him and allow suffering not to lead you away from him, but closer to him. I hope some of this was helpful to you today. I pray that God blesses you and your family and your day, and I look forward to seeing you here again next time.